thank you all for coming. Tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from two of our very own residents, Rubie and Woody Watson, and they're going to be telling us a little bit about Hong Kong and what it was like 50 years ago and what it's like now. So please give it up for the Watsons.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming tonight. I know a lot of us have our minds on Florida and places we've been and visited, and we hope all goes well for them. So, this is, we have spent a lot of time, first time 1969, in Hong Kong, and in just across the border in southeastern China. More than 50 years, actually. And we've seen tremendous changes, and we want to share with you tonight some of what we found in 1969 and some of what you would find if you went to Hong Kong today, and the dramatic differences between the two places. So, Hong Kong Island, I think I have one of these little guys down here, in southeastern China, became a colony of Great Britain. Great Britain basically seized Hong Kong Island in 1842, when Hong Kong Island was really only small villages. There was very few, maybe hundreds, not even thousands of people living on Hong Kong Island at that time. In 1898, let's see, glasses. I have glasses. Maybe I have them here. So, all right, we'll try without glasses.
These are just magnifiers.
That's what I use.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. It's not moving forward. All right. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. All right. So, this is then a detail of the map of China. This is Hong Kong Island, which the British seized in 1842. This is the new territories, which they leased from China, also under considerable pressure, in 1898. And this was the whole business about the relinquishment, the repatriation of Hong Kong in 1997. They had a 99-year lease on this part of Hong Kong, the new territories. And above this, many of you perhaps have visited this area. This is the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. So there is a very dense population in this area. Millions and millions of people live in this area. The area that they leased, the new territories, is about the size of a small Iowa county, I would say. And many of the villages at that time, it was a series of villages and market towns. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'll just shout. It was a series of villages and market towns with about a population of perhaps 100,000 in 1898. And many of the villages there date back to the 11th, 12th century. And And they look in 1969 something like this. This is very similar. It's actually a village that neighbored a village where we lived. So many of the villages were walled, and the houses were tightly packed terrace houses with perhaps a well and maybe a very small market in the middle of these walled villages for defensive purposes. Mostly bandits and also neighbors who were always ready to encroach on each other's property. Woody and I conducted our research over the years on local history. Local people thought of us as more as historians than anthropologists. Local history, family life, social and economic change. And there was a lot of social and economic change. This is very much what it would have looked like in the 1920s, 30s. This is actually from '69. So it's rice here, vegetables here, and then we're looking from the new territories into China proper, often called in Hong Kong, mainland China. Hong Kong is really a place of migrants. Many are Cantonese speakers. The national language is Mandarin, but most of the people in Hong Kong speak Cantonese. And many migrated from Canton, from Guangzhou, into Hong Kong when the British took over. And so the island of Hong Kong became fairly densely settled by the 1880s, 1890s. Again, in 1949, many people came across the border, some from Shanghai, most of them from Guangdong province, the neighboring province to Hong Kong, fleeing the communist, what was often referred to in Hong Kong as the communist takeover of China. So a lot of people came with nothing, really, to Hong Kong during that period. Again, in the 1960s, 60, 61, 62, although there was a hard border between Hong Kong and China, many people crossed illegally. Hundreds of thousands, really, from China into Hong Kong, fleeing the Great Leap. Some of you might have heard of the Great Leap famine, which was 1959, 1960, 61, in which something like 40 million people died in China. So many people fled. Again, a new influx of migrants into Hong Kong. So this kind of gives you a rundown. The Japanese occupied Hong Kong, as I'm sure you all know, from 1941 to 1945. The People's Republic was established in 1949. And in that period, from 1949 really into the 1970s, although the Chinese Communist Party was illegal in Hong Kong, there certainly were Chinese communists in Hong Kong. There were members of the oppositional Kuomintang who ended up in Taiwan, also in Hong Kong, and there were the British in Hong Kong. The British were really in control of the government, but these forces contended in various ways in Hong Kong, really throughout a good part of the period after the Second World War. The border between Hong Kong and China was porous, really until the Japanese occupation, so Most people at that time worked in factories, making toys or textiles. I think you all know, have a memory of things made in Hong Kong. Or some worked in service industries as well. Hong Kong was a very dynamic place, but also a very anxious place. Many people were worried about, at that time, in the late 60s, the Cultural Revolution and violence from the Cultural Revolution spilling over into Hong Kong, which it did in 1967, and there were very serious riots there. And this is actually a town that was built not this long ago, but this is a classic kind of new town. It would include subsidized housing, some public housing, and some private housing. They were usually a mix. And there would be restaurants and grocery stores, all kinds of commercial enterprises on the ground floor. And so they were really like little communities, and people might work in that community, or they might work in Hong Kong, in the urban centers. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Woody, who's going to talk about the research that we did in the new territories.
Okay, so this will be a bit of a tag team. I think that's the way Rubie and I always more or less lived our lives. So we did our field research, meaning our ethnographic field research as anthropologists in 2 villages over the last 50 years. The first one is called Santin, literally new field, Santin, and the other is Ha Chun. And basically I started my field research here as a Berkeley graduate student in 1969, and we both went. Rubie at that time was a student of anthropology, just finished her BA and was doing an MA at that time. So we both worked in this village. Then we came back in 1977 and 78. So basically a decade apart in these 2 communities. This is what the village of Santin, where I wrote my thesis about, looked like when we first showed up. Water buffaloes with birds sitting on them, basically keeping them free of vermin. And this is the the Chinese border right there, and this is the Hong Kong border right on this river. And this is what it looked like from our house for about almost 2 years when we lived here. You'll notice that on the Chinese side, there's very little you can see. The only thing that would appear once in a while would be a big slogan, and we could hear some chanting from Red Guards. And the chanting was in Mandarin, Da Dao, Meko Dibo Jui, which means down with American imperialism. We always took that personally. So, but there was very little activity at that time. And then things changed gradually. This is what it looked like. The same shot, the same place, in 1997, the year that that Hong Kong reverted to China. And this is the city of Shenzhen, just going up. Today, it's even more enormous, with 6 million people in there, something like that, right across the border. And our little village of Santin is still right down here, looking out and wondering what's happening. Meanwhile, the people of Santin, the village that I studied, basically became immigrants. Most of the men went to Britain and Holland and Canada, set up Chinese restaurants, gradually brought their families. So the village became hollowed out by about this time. So it's an interesting study of its own. That's what I wrote my thesis on at Berkeley, about the immigrant village. And let's see, back here. This is our house. We lived here for 17 months, 69 and 70. And it's a typical Chinese, typical village house. It was fixed up a little bit because it didn't have anything. Basically, all the bugs could get through, and so we had a local carpenter put this in. And we actually considered a real innovation. And afterwards, when we came back years later, we noticed that lots of more screen doors were going up because people decided keeping mosquitoes out was a good idea. And this is the somewhat younger Rubie Watson doing her field research in the village of Hachun a few years later. And Rubie did her research on women's subculture. In those years, the male universe and the female universe were very different indeed. Even though, of course, there was marriages and the production of children, women literally almost knew nothing about the lives of men and vice versa. And one of the things I remember about Rubie's work is that when she would come back with her notes and talk about it, we had a couple of young friends our age who would come over after dinner and talk to us. And Rubie would start telling them about what she was doing with women and their marriage patterns and their cultural system. And the young men would say, "What? Where were you? Was that you were working in East Africa or something?" they had no idea at all about what women's culture, life was like. So Rubie wrote a book and did a series of other projects on the women's subculture, including marriage, which she's written about a great deal. And this is an older woman inducting a new bride, all dressed up. Notice that she's looking down because she's supposed to be modest, into the new community, introducing her to the groom's ancestors. And here are, you notice this shot, it's all women except for the cop back there watching, who's not a member of the community at all. Women had their own rituals at the ceremonies. The men would stand on the side and talk, and the women would perform their rituals and talk among themselves, and the men hardly knew what was going on, frankly, at least in terms of the women's lives. And, okay, and now, what did I do? Well, I aged somewhat. This is 2009. I went back to the same village of Santine that I'd studied as a graduate student in the 1960s and met some of my old friends. And this is the lineage master, meaning he's the oldest of the generation closest to the ancestors. And so it's a very important ceremonial position. Happens to be an old friend, luckily for me, and I can ask him anything I want. Along with another old friend who's an immigrant in England, came back for this ritual, who speaks English and Cantonese, so we can switch to whatever we would like. But one of the things sidelined here, notice the women in this picture in 2009. I was completely flabbergasted when I went to this ritual because there were women present. Not only were they present, but they were actually worshiping the ancestors with incense. I was shocked. And I asked my old friends, and they said, "Well, things have changed." Okay, well, that's what happens in societies. So I'm tracking that now in some of the work that I'm doing, these changes. This is going back to the subculture in 1969, male subculture, men's lives, where I spent my life. Got up in the morning, got my cameras, and took off and did whatever the men did. And they were mostly involved with ritual activity. And this is pork division. Roast pork is chopped up, divided, and then spread among men, descendants of the founding ancestor. And you get the number of shares depending on how close you are to the ancestor. And then you give out the meat, and the women take the meat and cook it, and then people eat it, and the women only see it when it comes into the house. In other words, the women knew nothing, zero, about the system of men's lives, including these kind of activities. Male elders, dressed up once a year, performing the annual rites in celebration of the ancestors. They're going to kowtow in unison to the ancestor. And this is what they are paying their respects to. The ancestor tablets of this lineage, each of these tablets gives the posthumous name of a male ancestor, and incidentally, over here on the side, it mentions the surname of their wife or their concubine, sometimes these other men through this woman that I don't know who she was. But anyway, and it almost is that stark in terms of the subcultural system of the time. Now I'll do a few contrasts and then I'll turn it back to Rubie. Contrast, but 40 or 50 years of change, what's happened in the village life. Just quickly go through this. First, this is our village neighbor's, immediate neighbor's house. We lived about right here, and this was her nice house. And we always liked it a lot. It was classic traditional Chinese this is a feng shui, meaning wind and water, keeping the bad elements off. The ghosts come and they swoop off, like on a ski slope. That was explained to me by people. Protects this village house. A very nice place. And this is what it looked like when we came back in 2009. The woman who lived there was long gone, and her family basically took it and rebuilt it and made flats for I don't know how many families here, but it's the same place. And that's one of the contrasts that we've seen in the villages that we lived in. Another set of contrasts. Here I've noticed, and we all know, that there are a lot of very happily adjusted dogs that live here with people here at Oak East. Well, we quote had, I think you could difficult to say we had, our own watchdog in the village of Santi in 1969. And we called him A Phuc, which in Cantonese means lucky. Lucky was a very impressive dog, and he protected our house and he protected both of us as we walked around the village to a certain point. And then he would beat other dogs' territory and he would retreat, and then we had to be careful. But he was not a pet. You never touched him, you never got close to Lucky. And we fed him pretty well, and he protected our house quite well. Here's another watchdog tucked away in this wall village, in this doorway. One does not walk into that walkway without paying attention to the dog and being very careful. And it's best to have a cane if you do so. So, watchdogs were serious. They were workers. Then, Rubie and I came back in 2009. We had all kinds of episodes like this, where a little dog would come barking at us, and we'd go, like, oh my God, was going to attack us. And it was just a nice little pet, literally. A dog that you reach down and you pet. And these dogs are, believe it or not, going on a day trip from one of these high-rise buildings that Rubie showed, and there's an industry of people picking up the dogs and taking them out for walks into the countryside. And they're very friendly, and we were kind of stunned when we first encountered them. Other contrast, that there was a daily market in the villages where people bought their fresh food, vegetables, fish, and rice. And we ate from these markets, bought the food, brought it home, and cooked. I should say, Rubie ended up cooking it. She's a very good Cantonese cook, I should say. So that's how we survived. Now, like all the villagers, when we go back, we go to supermarkets and stores like this, as do the villagers. The villagers now have refrigerators. They even began to have freezers at a certain point, and we were flummoxed by all these developments. Other contrasts. Banqueting. Men socializing their grandchildren into proper eating behavior. Notice this guy is teaching his grandson to eat properly with chopsticks. And they're all eating from this common pot. It's a very traditional male form of Cantonese dining in the community. Now, since 1984, McDonald's has arrived in the nearby towns, and the kids all insist on going to McDonald's, or they did. Now I suppose there's probably a couple of new places there because in the Chinese calendar, everybody becomes 1 year older at New Year Day. So you age in sets of people. And now they age with individual birthdays, and then they have birthday parties. And that's another one of these major changes that occur. Other changes, the typical field, as Rubie showed earlier, rice ear and vegetables. This is from 1970 in the new territories. This is a more typical field. And they use the same character. Cantonese term teen, it's a character for field, for rice field, for both of these. And this is a field of containers, for container shipping across the ocean and eventually on American railways. So the land is now valuable for storage, not for growing vegetables. It's a big change. The older people are furious about this, but they can't do anything about it because of the money involved. Okay, I'll turn it back to you now.
Thanks. One of the things when Woody showed you the ancestral altar with all the tablets, the two villages where we did research had a depth of 32 generations. So the separation of the youngest males in the village, all males, are descended from this common ancestor with the same surname. And they have this 32 generations, and that's what they're celebrating when they come together for these rituals. So there is a sense of history in these communities. After Mao's death, we're back to the new towns. After Mao's death, as many of you know, there was a period of the so-called reform period in China, and there began to be tremendous economic growth, and this also affected Hong Kong. In the 1980s, the border between China and Hong Kong was reopened. I wouldn't say it's completely open. There are restrictions on who can, there are restrictions. People have to have special permits to come in from China. They have to have an exit permit from their local Communist Party headquarters. And people in Hong Kong, if they are not passport holders of the People's Republic of China, have to have a special permit to go into China. So there are restrictions, but there's a tremendous amount of movement between the two. Today, the population of Hong Kong is about 7.4 million. And as many of you know, in 1984, the British signed an agreement with the People's Republic of China to establish what is called the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. And they guaranteed in the basic law and in this agreement that they would allow for 50 years the preservation of a capitalist economy, a legal system, basically the British system that was in existence, and financial operations underpinned by this law, and an independent school system. There are 5 universities in Hong Kong and many, many new towns with populations ranging from maybe 200,000 to 500,000, something like that. So they're the old cities on the island of Hong Kong and Kowloon, and then there are all these new towns which were created during the colonial period, as were the universities. So the population of Hong Kong, the first census in Hong Kong was 1911, and the population of Hong Kong, as you can see, has been steadily increasing. The rice and vegetable fields that Woody talked about as he Most of the apartments are, a middle-class apartment would be something like 400, 450 square feet for a family. And that would be divided usually into 2 bedrooms and possibly 1.5 bathrooms. And that would be considered a handsome space by most people. Many people would live in less space than that. By some estimates, and I think I've already pointed out, something like 50% of the Hong Kong population still lives in subsidized or public housing. Since the 1980s, Hong Kong is really no longer a manufacturing center. Maybe 20%, possibly lower than that. Some of you may have a figure on this, of the population work in manufacturing. Most people work in the service industry or the financial industry in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a safety net, but not a very generous one. So unemployment, old age assistance, social security, some of these are new elements in Hong Kong that the British created in the last days of the colonial period and that were kept on by the Hong Kong government. But there's not a very generous system by any means. The Hong Kong citizens are citizens of the People's Republic of China, and they are also residents of Hong Kong. It's somewhat complicated, and there's a lot of strategizing by people in Hong Kong, deciding what kind of passport, and many people in Hong Kong do travel, want to go overseas, so many of them do hold passports. So you can have a Hong Kong special administrative region passport, and that will allow you to travel to many countries. You can also have that passport as well as be a passport holder of the People's Republic of China. Or you can have the Hong Kong passport as well as a United Kingdom overseas passport, which does not allow you residence in Great Britain, but allows you to travel with a special passport. It allows freer level of travel. And many people will have a Hong Kong passport and a passport, perhaps they're citizens of the UK. Many of the immigrants that Woody talked about would have actually UK citizenship and have UK passports, or a Canadian passport, or an Australian passport. So it's a very complicated thing what people choose and how they choose to have these passports. So Hong Kong has some problems that are not really unique to Hong Kong, that one finds really all over East Asia, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Hong Kong, and to some degree China, certainly in Chinese cities. They have an aging issue. Hong Kong has one of the highest life expectancy in the world. For women, it's 87.7 years in 2020. And they have one of the lowest total fertility rates in the world. So this is a list of Hong Kong's total fertility rate, 3.38 children per woman. In 1966 down to 2021. And you will notice that the population replacement, as many of you know, is 2.1. So Hong Kong's current rate is judged to be 1. And has actually gone up a little bit, but it's very, very low. China's total fertility rate is 1.7, although they have the one-child family policy no longer, but had it for something like 30, 35 years. The U.S. total fertility rate is 1.7, 1.8. Taiwan's rate is 1.2. South Korea's is considered to be the lowest in the world at 0.9. And Japan is somewhere about 1.2 or so. So that these are very low rates of fertility, which worries the government of Hong Kong and many people living in Hong Kong. The process by which China has abided by the so-called basic law has changed dramatically in the last few years, as many of you know. This is an image of the umbrella movement in 2014 and later. The umbrella movement was about many things, but one of the things it was certainly about was the right of Hong Kong people to, one person, one vote, select the chief executive of Hong Kong, the president of Hong Kong, the chairman of the board. This was written into the basic law, but was never granted. And so a select committee made up of a very small number of people, controlled really by the Communist Party and by very wealthy Hong Kong businessmen, selects the chief executive of Hong Kong. In fact, the current chief executive, John Lee, ran unopposed in the last election. And he was actually the chief of the Hong Kong police. So it's very difficult to say where Hong Kong is going to go now. One of the things that's happened is that there have been changes to the school curriculum, making it more, not the same, but similar to the curriculum in the People's Republic of China and mainland China. Mandarin, the national language, is encouraged in opposition to Cantonese, the local language. Hong Kong, as you know, has developed really draconian, the same kind of COVID policies of lockdowns and quarantines and not allowing visitors as China, although Hong Kong recently has broken with Beijing on that score, and they are now allowing more visitors. But in that period, many businesses, international businesses, have moved some part of their employees or their whole company to Singapore and Seoul, Korea. Those two seem to be the two favored places. So one can only really expect further changes of this sort. More censorship, less freedom of the press, more control over the school curriculum, and more people probably leaving Hong Kong, trying as best they can to make their way to Canada or Australia or certainly the UK or the United States. So with that, I will close and ask if you have any questions, either for Woody or for me. Are there any questions? Yeah.
With your, just that last statement that you made, when all of these additional restrictions that are being piled on, and people are desperate to get out, and yet the government there recognizes that fertility is so low, and any kind of continued growth in the population has to come from immigration.
Yes, so I think maybe most of you heard that. It was a question about very, very low fertility. And so where is the population, the future population that's going to help drive Hong Kong
And
prosperity?
how can you attract a future population when your laws are so stupid?
Right, so one of the things that they're doing is they're in giving short-term 2-year, 3-year, 4-year visas, in effect visas, permits for people to come from China and work in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government is also providing, I guess you would say, free education in Hong Kong's 5 universities to top rank. So in China, there is a national exam. Every child who wants to go to university takes the national exam. And for people who score very, very high in China, they can go to one of these Hong Kong universities for free. And some of them want to because their English is the language of instruction in these schools, usually. I mean, it varies, but officially, English is the language of instruction. And so many really, really bright Chinese students would see it as a way of building their resume, building their experience internationally.
But with no intention of staying.
But not necessarily with an intention of staying. That's right. So it's a question. I mean, the fertility rate in Hong Kong is perhaps not dissimilar to the fertility rate in Shanghai. I mean, so if you know, we don't want to compare apples and oranges here. So Shanghai's fertility rate is also very, very low. China's rate is higher because it has this huge, still, rural population. It's much smaller than it was, but this very large rural population. So Chinese cities also have concerns about the fertility rate, as does Japan, as does Korea, as does Taiwan. So it is
the U.S.
And as does the U.S. Right, 1.7. I mean, until, what, 3 years ago, the U.S. rate was 2.1 or 2.2, something like that. And then it's been falling significantly the last, what, 4 years, something like that. Yeah.
China's fertility rate was affected by their one-child policy. And that, was that applied in Hong Kong?
No.
Okay.
No.
But China has had to back off from that, I believe. I don't know if it's officially.
It has officially backed off. Yeah, so the one-child family policy, which was enacted in 1980, I think, Woody, 79, 80, and for something like 30 years or more, people in China could only have one child. If you were rural, if you had a rural residency and you had a girl, you could have another child. Because everybody wanted a boy. But this was never applied to Hong Kong.
Well, they did some gender selection in the pre-delivery.
I'm sorry,
They did some gender selection
Yes,
of the
yes.
fetus.
yes,
Okay.
yes,
To
absolutely.
get the boys.
Right, so there was, amniocentesis was done in order to determine the sex of the fetus, and abortion was often utilized so that the sex ratio in China, in parts of China, I don't think you would probably find that in Beijing or Shanghai, but certainly in rural China, you would find a very skewed sex ratio because of the use of abortion to abort a female fetus. But this doesn't explain Hong Kong, it doesn't explain Korea, it doesn't explain Taiwan, it doesn't explain Singapore, it doesn't explain these East Asian countries and what's going on here. I mean, what Hong Kong people will tell you, I think if you sat down and had tea with somebody, is that it's just too expensive. Children are expensive. And part of that is because the government is not very forthcoming with the kind of support that even here in the United States we have. Certainly nothing like you would find in parts of Northern Europe. And yeah, that's one argument. There are many reasons, no doubt, for this very low fertility rate. Are there, yeah?
Can you tell us about your work there? Who were you working for, and what exactly were you accomplishing?
Right. What do you want to answer that? I mean, I can answer for myself. So I did my PhD in Britain, and I was funded by Britain, the university funding is basically done at a national government level. And so I applied for a grant and received a grant to do my research. And my research was really looking at, as Woody said, women's lives, looking at changes in family life. Very broad. I mean, obviously, to write a thesis, it had to become a little more specific than that. But those were my broad interests. Woody, a little different. His PhD was here in the United States.
Yeah. And
You can tell them about Bert Hickman.
yeah, well, if I were to look for the origins of how I started, I have to thank former Senator Bert Hickenlooper of Iowa, who maintained that when they were dividing up federal money for language training, he earmarked a certain amount of money for so-called native Iowans to study Chinese, Russian, or Serbo-Croatian in the early 1960s when I showed up as an undergraduate without a nickel. I had about enough money, typical in those days, for one semester, and I had to figure out what to do. So I applied for, I figured that every kid in Iowa would want to study Russian in those years. That was 1962, 63. And I was right, every kid in Iowa applied to study Russian. So they all got, they had a huge competition. And there were 3 of us who decided to study Chinese. And so I was given a fellowship by the Fed, the federal government. And I continued to ride fellowships throughout my graduate career. Then I went to Berkeley and I got more federal money. And then I applied to go to, I had a choice in those days. I could go to Taiwan or we could go to Hong Kong. And by that time, Rubie was doing anthropology, doing a BA, and wanted to go to one of these places as well. So basically, I ended up in Hong Kong. And so that's where it started. I got federal money from the Ford Foundation through the U.S. government to continue to pay my way through graduate school, and then also to fund my PhD. So I hit the wave of anti-communism and anti-Chinese communism, and I got on that surfboard and I rode it. I rode it all the way from Berkeley to PhD to continue on. And Rubie and I bounced around the globe and ended up back in Iowa City,
I think
where we met.
if I remember correctly, there were 5 professors of Chinese language, literature,
Yeah.
history, and 3.
Well,
Is that right?
Bert Hickenlooper got the money, and the University of Iowa hired 5 instructors from Taiwan to teach Chinese. Basically, they had Mandarin in those days. And so they showed up here, and I always wondered, my God, what must they have thought? Coming here from Chicago or wherever, driving through the cornfields and ending up in Iowa City, and then having 3 Iowa kids sitting there eagerly. Well, we had 5 teachers and 3 students, and they took us into their homes, and we were so incredibly lucky because we learned Chinese from basically talking to their fathers and their mothers who came with them. And it was a wonderful experience here, and I really do feel grateful for that. And then I was able to continue doing it. When we got to Hong Kong, by the way, Rubie studied Mandarin in London, and I studied Mandarin all the way through Berkeley. And then we arrived at Kai Tak Airport, and I tried out my Mandarin to the cab driver, and he said, "Gong mat ya," which is Cantonese for, "What the hell are you trying to say?" And so basically, we figured, well, we better start learning Cantonese. And so we went to the local university, and they had a summer course, 5 students, all Americans, 3 missionaries, and 2 anthropologists studying Cantonese. And that's how it got started. Then we moved out to the new territories, and then we hit the local dialect. That's not city Cantonese, it's country Cantonese, which is what Rubie speaks very well indeed. on the phone, people would swear it's their Cantonese grandmother speaking to them. But it's just because that's what we picked up from the villagers, and we just kept going. That's kind of a long-winded way of
And then
explaining
did you continue?
how Bert Hickenlooper helped me get started. Yeah.
Did you continue to work, and what did you do?
Oh.
Who were you working for? Did you
Oh,
stay in Hong Kong?
no, but then we did our research. I came back to Berkeley. I wrote a PhD thesis. Rubie wrote an MA, and then eventually we ended up. First, I taught at the University of Houston. I have to get this right. First, I taught at the University of Houston for a year. Then we moved to Honolulu, where I taught at the University of Hawaii for 2 years. And then Rubie and I moved to London, where I taught at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Rubie then went to the LSE for her PhD, and we stayed there for, how many years did we make? 11 years in London, yeah, I almost forget. And then we moved to Pittsburgh, and then we were there for 5 years, and then we moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we were at Harvard for 22 years, and then we went back to the farm in Illinois. Time to do something else. Yeah.
In your presentation, which I would say, in Chinese it's a shushu for thank you. Yeah. It was very good. But you didn't speak much about the downtown commercial district. I was there in
Oh, and in Hong Kong.
In Hong Kong.
Yeah.
The commercial district, they have what they call the terminal market that ran out.
Oh,
of
yeah,
the
yeah,
way.
yeah, yeah.
And it was a lot of artisans work, and I got a carved wall library with
Oh, yeah.
walls and cells, and silk rug. and
Sure.
But then I went back again in 5 or 6, and it had changed a lot in downtown. I thought, and it was a lot more crowded. I mean, it was.
Well, we basically would come to town to eat, and there were Russian, gosh, that was right in those days, there were Russian restaurants in Hong Kong. We would come in from the village, and we would eat Western food. We'd go to the Russian restaurants and have a good nam nosh, and then we'd go back out for another 2 weeks or more. So we basically lived out in the countryside, and then came in periodically.
The first visit in Hong Kong, they had a Sunday market in the park
Yeah.
for jade. There must have been
Yeah, that's
200 or
right.
300 jade dealers.
There were, and there was a lot of that was Chinese refugee materials coming into Hong Kong. So it was a very lively place.
It was.
And there were Indonesian restaurants. There were just an amazing number of Chinese restaurants. And in that respect, it was a fantastic place to eat. I guess that's what we were mostly concerned with. in those
Well, Hong
days.
Kong was a way station for me on the way to Wuxi. I have to tell you, moving from my hotel to the manufacturing facility that I was kind of working with, I never met another car. They were all trucks and tractors on the island.
Yeah,
No cars.
my early photographs of China show a lot of tractors in Guangzhou, in Canton City, and in Beijing. There's hardly any traffic. And now it's just wall to wall. You can't even think about
Right.
getting around in these places now. Yeah, Wally?
So how are the people in your village that's still there, right? How do they feel about their lives? Are they feeling terribly oppressed? Are they feeling angry? What do they feel?
That's a good question, and we know some of it. We have to be careful about probing too much, but there's 2 villages. I guess you could say my village, which turned out to be the one on the border, and it became an immigrant village, and they're all gone, almost entirely gone. And even those people who retired from Belgium or from Canada came back to spend their last years in the village, they're all gone. And so it's like a ghost town, that village that I studied. Rubie's village, on the other hand, I say her village, where she wrote her thesis and did all the work. Still very much alive. And we have a lot of friends who are our age, and we're very worried about them. But they're careful. They're survivors, and we have to be careful about how we interact with them.
I think part of it is too that it gets back to the passport issue. So many villagers have strategized so that they've sent a child at 16, 17, 18 to Australia, who then gets a residency in Australia or Canada or less likely the United States, maybe the UK, or they've used Uncle so-and-so who immigrated to the Netherlands 25 years ago and takes on their son. So these young people who have then gone to Australia or the Netherlands or New Zealand or wherever may come back to Hong Kong, but they have secured a residency somewhere else. And so that's a very common strategy for many, many people in Hong Kong. So they are, the people in the new territories are, it's very much a mixed bag. Some of them are quite sympathetic to the People's Republic of China and to what has happened in Hong Kong. And some of them are not. But whether they're sympathetic or not sympathetic, they're still trying to get their child, their grandchild, or their son or their daughter to Australia as a, in the back pocket sort of thing.
It's been that way in this part of China. Go back to that first map. That southern region, the province of Guangdong, around Canton, and out into that delta, that's the heartland of immigration from China from almost, I would say, 300 years now. And all over the planet, in California and elsewhere, they all stem from that region. And the communities that we study would be very similar to the ones that are right across the border in terms of people having international connections.
We went back to Santine, I don't know, in the 90s, I guess, and we're walking down the lane and saw a young woman and started speaking to her in Cantonese. And she said in English, "Oh, I don't speak Cantonese." And it turned out that she was an Indonesian maid hired by an immigrant family to take care of grandma who had wanted to come and die in her native place. So it's...
And grandma spoke pretty good English.
And so it's a ghost town, but there are old elderly people living there, often with an Indonesian or Thai or Filipino maid. A servant.
It got surreal walking around the old village that we first settled in 1969. We didn't know what in the world was going to happen just by walking around and talking to people. What language were we going to use? And things like so. It was.
I think there was one more. Was there one more question? Yeah.
So why did so many people emigrate from that one area in China?
Good question.
Good question. It's partly because it's a process that kind of got started. There are networks to go to, and meaning that if you are ambitious, if you really want to make a life, you can make it much better abroad than you can by hanging around and working in one of those vegetable fields. Boy, that's for sure. Most of us in this room probably came from immigrant parents who understood that right away. I mean, I know I did, if you go
Why
back.
from that one area? Why not from other areas?
It's partly because of proximity to the Pearl River Delta. To be able to get out, to go to a place like Hong Kong where there were ships out, and also the city of Canton, which was from very early days, had international networks. And then there was Macau, the Portuguese colony, on the other side of that big delta that map we had. So there was Hong Kong on one side, British, English speaking, and there was Macau on the other, Portuguese, and God knows what they were speaking over in Macau. It was a wild, wonderful place. are places like that, all pockmarked, all along the Indian coast, that specialized in out-migration and entrepreneurial activity, and you couldn't keep them down if you tried. That sort of place.
Was there active recruitment for workers from like the States?
Well, you know, the American railways were largely.
I think too, until 1962, people in Hong Kong had the right to travel and reside in Britain.
Yeah.
And then in 1962, the British stopped that.
Because there were too many people.
And so many of the people from Santine there had been sailors in the village, and they were sophisticated enough to know that, and they really, many of them, dozens and dozens of them left in that period, like from 58 to 62. So that's part of the specific village, you know, why they did what they did.
Yeah, but the village that I studied was a classic immigrant community where everybody knew networks. They knew where to go, how to get a passport. It's the sort of thing that kids learned when they were 10 years old. Whereas you go 20 miles north and you'll find an agricultural village where they haven't got any more idea how to do that, and how to build an airplane. So it's tradition. And I just happened to find a place that was like that. That was all circumstance. But I feel incredibly lucky that I stumbled into this wild, really extremely interesting place. As Rubie did when she chose her place too, where the women were, my God, the subculture that Rubie found in that community where she studied, it was mind-blowing. The women had just an enormous, wild, active life that the men had no more idea than a grasshopper on what the women were doing. And they weren't interested.
It was the other way.
And
The other way. And the women didn't care what those guys were doing out there in the ancestral hall, kowtowing to some stupid tablets, you know. They didn't care because they had their own very active life. And Rubie would get up in the morning early, and she had a young woman who was a kind of research assistant, introduce her more than anything else, would come and pick her up. She would disappear, and I wouldn't see her. I'd be out running around too, and then she'd come back sometimes in the evening with the most bizarre stories about what women were, the cultural system that women had. And it's unlike anything that Westerners, Europeans can imagine, the distinction between the two lives, the two genders.
yeah.
Sorry, I'm going on.
No, it's very powerful, but it's gone now.
Yeah, it's going on.
So that husbands and wives do things together. They go to things like this. They go to movies. They go to restaurants. They're two parents and one child.
Yeah.
Grandma and grandpa live somewhere else. So they have become, in many ways, if we all spoke Cantonese, we wouldn't be uncomfortable in many of the culture, or we wouldn't be wary or feel it strange. Many of the cultural